The air inside the train station was busy and full of noise. People rushed past one another, dragging suitcases, checking their phones, calling out to friends or family. The sound of footsteps, chatter, and rolling luggage filled the space. Announcements echoed through the speakers, telling passengers where to go and when the next train would arrive. Among all the movement and noise, a single upright piano stood quietly near one of the pillars. It had been placed there for anyone to play. Most days, people passed it without even looking at it. Sometimes a child would bang a few keys or an older man would sit for a short tune. But that day, the piano waited in silence. Then, through the crowd, someone appeared. She wasn't dressed like someone who wanted attention. She wore a long, dark coat, a scarf wrapped around her neck, and a small bag slung over her shoulder. Her walk was calm but slow, almost as if she wasn't sure where she was going. A few people noticed her as she moved toward the piano. Something about her presence felt different, like she carried a quiet purpose. She stopped in front of the piano and looked at it for a moment, as if she was remembering something from long ago. A group of teenagers sitting nearby whispered to each other. They had been laughing loudly just moments ago, but now they turned to watch. A street performer at the other end of the hall stopped tuning his guitar and glanced over. Even the cleaner pushing his cart paused for a moment. The woman looked around once, then slowly removed her gloves. Her hands looked delicate, her fingers slightly thin and pale, but there was something graceful in the way she moved them. She touched the edge of the piano lightly, brushing away a bit of dust, and then she sat down on the wooden bench. The sound of her coat rustling broke the momentary stillness. She took a quiet breath, closed her eyes, and placed her fingers gently on the keys. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The crowd went back to its rhythm. A little boy tugged his mother's hand, asking for a snack. Someone's phone rang. A train whistle blew in the distance. And then, a single note broke the air. It was soft, almost hesitant, like a whisper in a noisy room. Then another note followed, and another. Slowly, the notes began to form a pattern, a small melody that rose and fell like gentle waves. It was simple at first, but there was something about it that made people stop. The sound felt warm and full of emotion, like it carried a hidden story. A man walking past slowed down. Then a woman dragging her suitcase stopped to listen. The group of teenagers who had been joking moments before grew quiet. Within seconds, the space around the piano changed. The noise of the station didn't vanish, but it softened, as if the music had pushed it to the edges. Her fingers started to move faster with more confidence. The melody grew deeper, richer, like it had found its heart. She played with both power and grace, each note clear, each movement full of meaning. People began recording on their phones, but the woman didn't seem to notice. Her eyes stayed closed most of the time, and when they opened, they weren't looking at anyone. It was as if she was seeing something far beyond that station. A memory maybe, or a feeling she couldn't describe with words. As the music filled the air, it began to tell a story without speaking. Some felt sadness in it, others felt peace. A young couple standing nearby held hands tighter. An old man sitting on a bench wiped his eyes. The cleaner leaned against his cart and smiled faintly. Even the children, who normally would have been restless, stood quietly beside their parents, watching the mysterious woman play. Every person in that place seemed connected by that sound, even though none of them knew who she was or where she came from. She didn't look like a performer or a celebrity. Her clothes were simple, her hair slightly messy, her face calm but serious. There was no sign or camera crew, just one woman and a piano. After a few minutes, the melody changed again. It became lighter, more hopeful, like sunlight breaking through clouds. The rhythm danced gently, and for the first time, the woman smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small one, but it made her face glow with something pure, joy maybe, or relief. A child clapped his hands without realizing it, and his mother gently hushed him, but the woman didn't mind. She kept playing, her movements soft and natural, as if the music was flowing through her instead of from her. The moment was so alive that no one dared interrupt. The trains kept coming and going, but inside that small circle of people, time seemed to slow. Everyone wanted to know who she was, but no one wanted to ask. They were afraid that speaking might break the spell. Her coat slipped slightly off her shoulder as she played, revealing a simple silver bracelet. Someone noticed that it was worn and scratched, as if it had been with her for many years. She wore no makeup, no jewelry except that bracelet. She didn't look wealthy, yet she played with the skill of someone who had spent a lifetime with music. The melody softened again. It became almost like a lullaby, tender and emotional. People could feel that there was pain hidden in it. Maybe the memory of someone she had lost or a dream she had once chased. Her head tilted slightly as her fingers slowed. Each note lingered longer than the one before, as if she didn't want the music to end. Then just when it seemed like the song was fading, she began a new phrase, something even more powerful. It was as if she was telling the world, "I'm still here." The piano answered her with its full voice echoing through the hall. The sound was no longer shy or quiet. It was brave and full of life. A man standing nearby whispered, "Who is she?" But no one had an answer. Some thought she might be a street performer. Others guessed she was a traveler who had missed her train. A few wondered if she was once a professional musician who had left everything behind. Whatever the truth was, it didn't matter at that moment. What mattered was the feeling she created. That rare, beautiful pause in everyday life where strangers forgot their worries and simply listened. The woman's expression changed again as she played the final few lines. Her eyes glistened, not with tears but with something softer. Emotion, peace, maybe understanding. She lifted her fingers one last time, holding them above the keys for a brief moment before letting the final chord fade into silence. And just like that, the station was quiet. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then, one by one, people began to clap. The sound of applause echoed through the open space louder than any train. She opened her eyes, surprised at first, then smiled gently and gave a small nod. But before anyone could speak to her, she stood up, picked up her gloves, and placed them carefully into her coat pocket. She adjusted her scarf, looked once more at the piano, and then began walking toward the exit. The crowd parted quietly to let her pass. Some tried to call out, but she didn't turn around. She simply walked away, disappearing into the stream of travelers moving through the hall. The applause faded, but the moment didn't. The music still seemed to hang in the air, soft and invisible. People looked at each other, smiling, shaking their heads as if they couldn't quite believe what had just happened. A few remained near the piano as though expecting her to return. A little girl climbed onto the bench after a while and pressed a few random keys, but the sound felt empty now. The magic had gone with the mysterious woman. Still, something had changed in that space. For a short time, everyone there had shared something real, something pure. No one knew her name or her story, but they all knew they had witnessed something rare, and though the woman had left without a word, her music stayed behind. It lived quietly in the memory of everyone who had been there, like a gentle reminder that beauty often arrives without warning, stays for only a moment, and then disappears, leaving the world just a little brighter than before. The video began spreading online that same night. Someone who had been in the station had uploaded it to a social media page, writing only a short caption. This woman played like her soul was speaking. Within hours, people started sharing it. At first, it was just a few likes, a few comments, but by the next morning, the video had been seen by thousands. People from different countries wrote how the music made them cry, how it felt like something inside them had been touched. Some said they hadn't heard anything that beautiful in years. Others said it reminded them of someone they had lost or a dream they had forgotten. The video wasn't perfect. You could hear the noise of the station, the echo of announcements, and even the sound of a baby crying in the distance. But somehow, all of that made it even more real. The mysterious woman in the long coat became a topic of conversation everywhere. Nobody knew her name. Her face wasn't completely clear in the video, and she had left before anyone could speak to her. People began calling her the unknown pianist, the lady of the station, and the woman with the silver bracelet. Someone even slowed down the video and zoomed in on her hands, noticing the tiny scratches on the bracelet she wore, a sign that it might have been old or very special to her. Meanwhile, far from the noise of the internet, the woman herself had no idea what was happening. She woke up the next morning in a small rented room above a quiet cafe, the same way she had for the past few months. Her mornings were simple: a cup of tea, a window view of the street below, and the sound of people going about their day. She lived a life that was quiet and unseen. There were no interviews, no concerts, no big audiences. It had been years since she had stepped on a stage. For her, that day in the train station had not been planned. She had gone there only to catch a train to another city. But when she saw the piano, she couldn't stop herself. Something inside her had drawn her toward it, an old part of her heart that still remembered what it felt like to play. She had sat down without thinking about it, and once her fingers touched the keys, the world around her had disappeared. After that performance, she had walked away, without looking back. She didn't expect anyone to notice, let alone record it. To her, it had just been a few minutes of music, a private conversation between her and the piano. A few days later, she began to notice strangers looking at her differently when she walked down the street. In a cafe, someone whispered and pointed at their phone. Another time, a young man came up to her and asked softly, "Was that you at the station?" She was surprised. How did he know? When she looked at his phone, she saw the video, her video, playing on the screen. Her heart froze. She watched herself sitting at the piano, her coat, her hands, her music, everything, now seen by millions. The comments were endless. People wrote about how her playing made them feel alive again. Some said her music helped them through hard days. But she didn't feel joy. Instead, she felt exposed. That moment had been private, and now it belonged to the world. She thanked the young man politely and left the cafe. For the rest of the day, her thoughts were heavy. She walked along the river, the wind cold against her face. Memories began to return, memories she had tried to bury for years. Once she had played in grand concert halls. She had studied music since she was a child, spending endless hours practicing until her fingers bled. Her passion had been everything. The piano had been her closest friend, her voice her safe place. She had traveled, performed, and made people feel something through her music. But then everything changed. A personal tragedy, something she never spoke about, had taken away her will to play. One day she simply stopped. For a long time, the piano stood silent in her home. Dust gathered on the keys. Every time she tried to play, her heart ached too much. Eventually, she sold the piano and disappeared from the music world entirely. She became just another face in the crowd, trying to live quietly without anyone knowing who she used to be. And yet, years later, in that train station, she had played again. Not for fame, not for applause, but because something deep inside her needed to. That day, when her fingers touched the keys, it was as if the weight she had been carrying finally began to lift. She didn't realize how deeply her music had reached others. The next week, journalists began searching for her. Some claimed they knew who she was. Others made guesses and wrote stories, but the woman avoided all of it. She didn't want the attention. She didn't want to return to a world she had already left behind. Still, her story touched countless hearts. Musicians around the world began playing the same tune she had played, trying to recreate the feeling. Some said the melody carried something divine, something almost impossible to explain. Others said it reminded them that music comes from the soul, not from fame or perfection. Meanwhile, the train station where it all happened became something of a special place. People came there just to see the piano. Some sat and tried to play her song. A few even left flowers beside the instrument. The workers at the station said that ever since that day, people seemed a little kinder there. Strangers smiled more. Travelers stopped to listen when someone played. The piano, once ignored, had become a symbol of peace in a place full of noise. One night, long after the video had gone viral, the woman returned to the station. She wore a different coat this time, her hair tucked under a scarf. She sat quietly on a bench far from the piano and watched as another person, a young girl, sat down to play. The girl's fingers trembled at first, but the sound that came out was full of courage. The woman watched with soft eyes and a faint smile. When the girl finished, she clapped gently and whispered, "Keep playing." The girl looked up and smiled back, not knowing who the woman was. The woman stayed there for a while, listening to others play. Some were good, some were just learning. But every sound reminded her why she had fallen in love with music in the first place. She realized something, that art doesn't belong to the past. It lives wherever people keep it alive. Before leaving, she walked up to the piano one more time. She touched the keys but didn't play. Instead, she took off her silver bracelet and placed it gently on top of the piano. Then she walked away again, disappearing into the quiet of the night. The next morning, people found the bracelet and placed it in a small box beside the piano with a note, "For the woman who played from the heart." The video continued to spread for months. Musicians, students, and even people who had never touched a piano before said it inspired them to learn. Concert halls began dedicating performances to her. Her identity was still a mystery, but maybe that was what made it beautiful, that no one needed to know her name to understand what she had given. In a world full of noise and distraction, she had reminded people of something simple, that one honest moment can touch more hearts than any fame ever could. And though she lived quietly, far from the screens and headlines, she carried with her a quiet sense of peace. She knew now that her music had not been lost. It had simply been waiting for her to find it again and to share it one last time. Weeks passed, but the story of the mysterious woman at the piano didn't fade. Even after new videos appeared and new trends came and went, her performance still stayed in people's minds. There was something about that moment, the emotion in her playing, the honesty in her silence, that people couldn't forget. Music teachers showed the clip to their students, telling them that this was what it meant to play with heart. Travelers who passed through the same station often stopped to take a photo with the piano, whispering that they wished they could have been there that day. Someone even printed a still image of her playing and taped it to the wall near the piano, with a short message underneath. You reminded us what real music feels like. The piano had become more than just an instrument. It was now a symbol of something beautiful, a reminder that art could still bring people together in a world that often felt divided. Every day, strangers from all walks of life came to sit on that same bench and play. Some played beautifully, others barely knew a few notes, but no one cared. The sound of the piano became part of the station's heartbeat. The woman, however, stayed hidden. She had moved to a quieter town outside the city. Life there was simple. Quiet streets, small shops, children playing in the park, and a bakery that smelled of fresh bread every morning. She liked it that way. She kept to herself, never speaking of her past. The world knew her as a mystery, but she only wanted peace. Every morning she took long walks near the river. She liked watching the water move, calm one moment, restless the next. Sometimes she brought along a small notebook. In it, she wrote down pieces of music that came to her mind, little fragments of melodies that drifted in like whispers. She didn't think of them as songs for others. They were just small pieces of herself, thoughts she couldn't express in words, but even in her quiet new life, she couldn't fully escape her past. Letters began arriving at her old post office box, some from strangers who had found out her name, others from musicians who wanted to thank her. One letter came from a young man who wrote that he had been about to give up music completely until he saw her video. Her performance, he said, reminded him why he started playing in the first place. He ended his letter with a simple line, "You made me believe in music again." Reading that, she felt something stir inside her, a feeling she hadn't let herself feel for a long time. Maybe, she thought, her music wasn't lost after all. Maybe it still had a purpose. That night, she sat by the small piano she had recently bought secondhand. It wasn't anything special, just a slightly worn upright with a few uneven keys. But when she touched it, the familiar feeling returned. The sound wasn't perfect, but it was honest. She played softly at first, unsure, then let her hands move freely. The melody that came out wasn't planned. It was gentle, like a memory being retold. It carried the same emotion she had played with at the station, a mix of sadness, peace, and hope. For the first time in years, she played not out of habit or discipline, but because it made her feel alive again. When she finished, she smiled quietly to herself. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. Word of her possible identity continued to grow online. Some people claimed to have found old videos of her performing years ago on stage. In one clip, a much younger version of her played in a grand concert hall surrounded by applause. The sound was flawless, professional, but it didn't have the same emotion as her performance at the station. People began to notice that difference. They said her earlier music had been brilliant, but her latest playing felt real. Comments flooded the internet again. She plays like someone who has lived every note. This is what passion sounds like. Her silence spoke louder than any interview ever could. People wanted to know her story. Who was she really? What had made her walk away from the world of music? Why had she returned that day at the station? But she never gave an answer. She ignored every message, every offer, every invitation to appear on TV or at concerts. The truth was simple. She didn't want to be a story. She had already lived through the spotlight once, and it had taken something from her. What she wanted now was peace, and music that belonged only to her. Still, she couldn't stop thinking about the people her music had touched. Every time she played, she imagined them, the travelers, the children, the strangers in that crowd, and she felt connected to them in a quiet, invisible way. One cold evening, she returned to the station again. The crowd was thinner this time, and the piano sat quietly in its usual corner. A small light above it flickered softly. She walked closer and noticed something that made her pause. There was a little box beside the piano with her silver bracelet inside. Someone had written a message on a folded piece of paper. "Still waiting for you to return." Her eyes softened. She sat down on the same wooden bench. It felt familiar, like returning home. She placed her fingers on the keys again, unsure what to play, then let her heart decide. The melody that came was different this time. It was warmer, calmer. It wasn't about loss anymore. It was about acceptance, about finding beauty even in pain. The few people who were there stopped and turned toward her. Some recognized her immediately. Others just felt something special in the sound. This time she didn't rush away when she finished. She looked up and smiled at the small crowd that had gathered. For a brief moment their eyes met, strangers sharing something pure and wordless. When she stood up, someone asked, "Will you come back again?" She didn't answer directly. She just said softly, "Music always finds its way back." Then she walked away once more, leaving behind the sound of peace in the air. Over the next few months, people noticed something strange. Though she was never officially seen again, new pieces of music began appearing online, simple recordings, always anonymous, posted from unknown accounts. Each piece carried the same feeling, gentle, emotional, and full of life. People began calling these the lost melodies. Some believed they were hers. Others said they were written by those she had inspired. It didn't really matter who made them. What mattered was that the spirit of her music continued to live on. In quiet corners of the world, young musicians began to play her melodies in schools, cafes, and small gatherings. They didn't seek fame. They just wanted to share the same feeling she had given them. That deep sense of connection and honesty that comes when music speaks from the soul. And somewhere, far away from all the noise, the woman listened to one of those recordings on her old radio one evening. She smiled faintly as she recognized the notes. She knew then that her music had finally become what it was always meant to be, free. The world didn't need to know her name anymore. Her story wasn't about who she was. It was about what she had given. A reminder that beauty can come from silence, and that even when a voice disappears, its echo can continue to touch hearts for generations. She stood by the window that night, looking at the moon reflecting on the river. The air was cool and quiet. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she could hear faint music, maybe someone playing her melody on another piano, in another place under another sky. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "That's enough," and in that stillness there was peace. Time passed quietly. The world moved forward, but the memory of the mysterious pianist never truly faded. Even though her name remained unknown, her story continued to live in people's hearts. Videos of her performance kept circulating online, and every now and then, someone would rediscover it and share it again. Each time, it reached new people, new places, new hearts. For most, she was just a legend, a story told about a woman who appeared out of nowhere, played something magical, and then vanished again. But for a few people, her music had changed something deep inside. It had become more than just a memory. It was a reason to keep going, a small spark of hope. In the city, the train station piano still stood in its place. It had been repaired a few times, cleaned often, and even tuned by volunteers who wanted to keep it alive. A small photo of the woman, taken from that original video, was now framed and placed beside it. Beneath the photo, someone had written a few simple words. She reminded us that music is still alive. Every day, someone new came to sit on that bench. Some played her melody as best they could. Others played their own songs. The sound of the piano became a part of the city's rhythm, blending with footsteps, laughter, and passing trains. Even those who didn't stop to listen could feel something peaceful in the air whenever they passed by. Meanwhile, in her quiet town by the river, the woman lived her simple life as always. She no longer feared the world knowing about her music. The attention had faded, and she was grateful for that. The noise had gone, leaving only silence and peace. two things she had longed for. She had found joy in small things now. The smell of bread from the bakery downstairs, the sound of rain on her window, the gentle creak of her piano's keys when she played late at night. Music had become her companion again, not her burden. She didn't play for anyone else anymore. She played for herself. And maybe for the memories she carried quietly inside. Sometimes she walked through the small streets of her town, passing by people who had no idea who she was. She liked that anonymity. She liked blending into the world unnoticed, unseen. She no longer needed recognition. She had already learned that real fulfillment didn't come from applause. It came from peace. One evening, while she sat by her window watching the sunset, she heard the faint sound of a piano coming from across the street. The notes were clumsy, uncertain, the kind of sound made by someone still learning. Curious, she opened her window slightly. Across the road, through another open window, she could see a young boy sitting at an old upright piano. His small hands moved awkwardly over the keys, but there was something sincere about his effort. He played a few wrong notes, stopped, tried again. She smiled to herself. Then suddenly she realized what tune he was trying to play. It was hers. The melody she had played that day in the station. Her heart softened. The boy must have learned it from the video. He played it slowly, one note at a time, but even in its imperfect form, she recognized the feeling in it, that same simple emotion that had connected so many people. That night she decided to write down the full melody. For the first time she wanted to leave it behind properly, not as a random moment but as something real, something others could continue. She wrote each note carefully, her handwriting steady but gentle. When she finished, she looked at the paper and felt something inside her ease. It was as if she had finally completed a circle that began long ago. The next day, she printed a few copies of the sheet and walked to the local music school. It was a small place run by kind teachers who taught children to play instruments after school. She didn't tell them who she was. She just handed them the sheet music and said softly, "Maybe someone can use this to learn." The teacher smiled and accepted it with a nod, not realizing who was standing before her. The woman smiled back, then quietly left. Weeks later, she passed by the school again and heard children playing her melody on small pianos inside. Their laughter mixed with the music, filling the air with life. She stood outside for a while, listening with tears in her eyes, not of sadness, but of quiet happiness. Her song had become theirs now. That was enough for her. As time went on, stories began to appear online again. Not about her directly, but about the song. Musicians around the world started performing it, each one giving it their own touch. Some played it in grand halls, others on street corners or in small cafes. It became known simply as the station song. No one knew the original composer's name, and maybe that was what made it so special. It belonged to everyone. Even people who didn't play instruments listened to it during their morning walks or late-night drives. It became a kind of quiet companion for people everywhere. A soft reminder of emotion, humanity, and beauty. The woman sitting by her window occasionally heard about these things through the radio or from conversations in the cafe below her apartment. She never said anything, but every time she heard that tune mentioned, she smiled. She had once thought her story had ended years ago, but now she realized that endings don't always come when we expect them. Sometimes they turn into beginnings for others. Her music had started a quiet chain, one that connected people across distance and time. One cold winter afternoon, she decided to visit the city again. It had been a long time since she had seen the train station. She took a small bag, wrapped herself in her old coat, and caught the first morning train. The journey felt familiar. The steady rhythm of the train, the soft murmur of passengers, the blur of the landscape outside. She watched the fields pass by, remembering the years she had spent traveling for concerts long ago. Back then it had always been about reaching a destination. Now it was simply about the journey. When she finally arrived, the city felt bigger, louder, busier, yet somehow the same. She walked slowly through the crowded halls until she saw it, the piano still standing proudly in its place. There were people around it, as always. A young woman was sitting at the bench playing her melody. The sound filled the space beautifully. The crowd was quiet, listening, just as they had once listened to her. But this time it wasn't her hands on the keys. It was someone else's, and that was how it was meant to be. She stood at the edge of the crowd, her eyes glistening. No one recognized her. She looked older now, softer, almost like a shadow of the person she once was, but inside she felt complete. When the young woman finished, the crowd clapped warmly. The pianist smiled and bowed slightly. Before she stood up, she looked at the picture beside the piano, the same framed image that showed a woman in a long coat playing years ago. She touched it gently and whispered something only she could hear. Then she turned and walked away. The older woman, the mysterious pianist, and smiled quietly and turned too. She walked toward the exit, her steps steady, her heart light. As she reached the door, she heard a child near the piano ask his mother, "Who is that woman in the picture?" The mother replied softly, "Someone who reminded us that music comes from the heart." The woman paused, looked back one last time, and then stepped into the bright sunlight outside. The sound of the piano followed her faintly through the open doors, blending with the city noise, alive, eternal, free. That day, she didn't need to play again. She had already left her song behind, and somewhere deep down she knew it would keep playing, not through her hands but through all the others who had felt its magic. She walked down the busy street with a peaceful smile. The world around her moved fast, but she didn't rush. Every sound, every moment, every passing voice felt like part of a larger symphony, one that never truly ended. And though no one knew her name, everyone had heard her song. Years went by quietly. Seasons came and went, and the world continued to move in its endless rhythm. The piano at the station remained where it had always been, polished, tuned, and loved by all who passed. It had become a symbol of connection, of hope, and of music's power to speak without words. Every day, new faces appeared around it. Travelers, workers, children, and even strangers who had just wandered in by chance. Each of them had a story, and somehow the piano became part of it. Some played cheerful tunes, some played soft, sad ones, but every song added to the same invisible thread that had begun years ago with one mysterious woman. The framed picture beside the piano had faded slightly with time. The woman in the long coat still looked calm and focused as her fingers touched the keys. People often stopped to read the small note beneath it. She reminded us that music is still alive. Many of them didn't know who she was, but it didn't really matter anymore. Her story had become larger than one person. It had become something everyone could feel, something that lived in every note played on that piano. One chilly evening, a young man arrived at the station carrying a small backpack and an old violin case. His clothes were simple, and his face showed the quiet fatigue of someone who had been traveling for too long. He looked around, noticed the piano, and smiled faintly. He opened his violin case, took out the instrument, and began to tune it gently. Then, as if drawn by some invisible force, he started to play along with the pianist already there, a woman softly playing the station song. The violin joined in naturally, wrapping around the piano's melody like an old friend finding its way home. People turned their heads, drawn by the sound. Some stopped walking. Some recorded on their phones. For a few moments, the entire station felt alive with harmony. When the piece ended, the pianist looked at the young man and asked with a kind smile, "Where did you learn that melody?" He hesitated for a moment, then said quietly, "My mother used to play it. She told me it was her favorite song. She said she heard it once at a train station a long time ago. I've been searching for where it came from ever since." The woman smiled warmly, her eyes soft. "Then I think you found it," she said. The young man nodded, looking at the framed picture beside the piano. His gaze lingered on the photo, the mysterious woman with the calm face playing with such emotion that even a still image seemed alive. He didn't say anything more, but something in his eyes changed. There was a quiet understanding there, a connection he didn't need to explain. When the train whistle blew, he packed up his violin and bowed slightly to the crowd. The pianist smiled again, and they exchanged a small nod before he left. No one knew his name, and he didn't look back, but his music stayed in the air long after he was gone. That night, as the station lights dimmed and the crowd thinned, a soft rain began to fall outside. The piano stood alone again, its keys glistening faintly under the lamps. Yet even in the empty hall, it felt as though the melody still lingered there, echoing faintly through the space, alive in memory. Far away in a quiet village near the river, an older woman sat by her window as rain pattered softly against the glass. The years had touched her gently, leaving silver strands in her hair and fine lines around her eyes. But her spirit was still steady, still filled with that quiet warmth that had once poured through her music. She no longer performed, no longer traveled, but her small apartment was still full of sound. A piano stood by the wall, its surface covered with sheets of handwritten notes and small sketches. Some were new, some decades old. Each page held pieces of her journey, fragments of her life translated into melody. That evening she made herself a cup of tea and sat by the piano. Her hands hovered over the keys for a moment before she began to play. The notes came softly, like whispers of memory. It was the same song, the station song, but slower now, more fragile, like a story being retold one last time. Halfway through, she paused, listening to the silence that followed each note. It was peaceful, not lonely. She smiled faintly, remembering faces she had seen, people she had touched with her music without ever knowing their names. She closed her eyes and continued to play until the final note faded gently into the quiet night. For a long while, she sat there, her fingers resting on the keys. Then, almost without thinking, she reached into the drawer beside her and took out an old envelope. Inside it was a faded photograph, a picture of the station piano taken years ago. She looked at it fondly, then turned it over. On the back, in small handwriting, someone had written, "Thank you for reminding us what music really means." She didn't remember who had given it to her, but she kept it always. It was a small reminder that what she had shared still lived on. The next morning, she decided to visit the river. The air was cool and fresh, and sunlight shimmered on the surface of the water. She walked slowly along the path, her steps unhurried. Every sound, birds, wind, the soft flow of the river, felt like part of a quiet symphony only she could hear. She sat on a wooden bench by the edge and watched the ripples move across the water. Somewhere in the distance, a child was humming a tune, faint but familiar. It was her melody again, passed from voice to voice, heart to heart. She smiled. That was enough. As the day went on, the world around her carried on as usual, people talking, trains moving, children laughing. But to her, it all felt connected. Every moment was a small piece of music, and she could feel it everywhere. In the city, the piano continued to stand as strong as ever. Musicians kept playing. Some played for themselves, some for others. Sometimes a small child would point at the framed photo and ask who the woman was. Parents would shrug or tell different stories, some true, some imagined. But all of them carried the same message, that one person, through a simple act, could touch the world without ever asking for recognition. Years later, the young man with the violin returned to the station. He was older now, his shoulders broader, his eyes wiser. He carried the same violin case, though it looked more worn with time. When he reached the piano, he opened the case and placed a small bouquet of white flowers beside the photo. He sat down on the bench and began to play, softly, beautifully, the same melody his mother once played. The crowd gathered again, drawn by the familiar tune. Some recognized it immediately. Some didn't know the name, but they felt it all the same. When the last note ended, the hall was silent for a moment before applause filled the air. The man looked up at the framed picture, smiled, and whispered quietly, "Thank you." He didn't know her story in full. No one did. But her song had guided his entire journey. And in that moment, it felt as though she was there, listening. Outside, the evening sun spilled through the station windows, bathing everything in warm, golden light. Dust floated in the air like tiny stars, and for a moment, the world seemed completely still. The piano stood at the center of it all, glowing softly. Generations would come and go, faces would change, but the melody would remain, simple, pure, timeless. Somewhere, perhaps beyond the noise of the city, beyond the limits of time, the mysterious woman smiled. Her story had reached its quiet ending, not with fame or applause, but with something far greater. The knowledge that what came from her heart had found its way into countless others. Music had carried her spirit forward, long after she stopped playing. It had crossed oceans, entered homes, comforted strangers, and inspired those who needed a little hope. And maybe that was what she had always wanted, not to be remembered, but to remind others to feel to listen, to believe that even in a noisy world, beauty still existed.